Dobry wieczór. Dobry dnia. It's 5:15 here local time in Odessa, Mama. Got the legendary Odessa Opera House right behind me. Most of Europe is scorching, and here in Odessa is no different. Welcome to today's live stream. Got the appropriate T-shirt on for today because we are going to discuss how, I guess, the combination of these military and the Ukrainian society have conspired to lead us to the question, how much longer for Vladimir Putin? For how much longer is he going to survive in power in the Russian Federation? Putin's been in power since, when is this? 2001 he came to power. Sometimes I forget how long he's actually been there, but he's been there for over 25 years at this point. And you don't get to stay dictator, leader of Russia, the Russian Federation, for so long without being pretty ruthless and pretty street smart, I would say, about how to stay in power. The proof is in the pudding. He's been there for 25 years, but his decision in 2022 to attack this country yet again, obviously he attacked in 2014 and illegally annexed and occupied parts of southern and eastern Ukraine, but that decision in February 2022 has led us to his current predicament at the moment. He is more or less caught in a dilemma from what I can see. And today's live stream, I'll speculate a little bit. Speculate first, I guess, analyze and give you my assessment of how long he is likely to stay in power. There has been a lot of talk. It's easy to be sensationalist here on a platform like YouTube and say there's a plot, a coup d'etat afoot in Moscow. Well, the reality is, if it was that obvious that we could all see it from this far away without being part of a three-letter agency, then for sure Vladimir Putin himself would know about it. He would have taken action to snuff that in the bud. So, just a quick update. It is obviously, as I mentioned at the top of this live stream, super hot in Central and Western Europe. And also, it is a little bit warmer than normal here in Odessa during the summer. Now, it does get to mid-30s anyways in Odessa during the summer. So I think I saw 36 on the thermometer. It's 36 Celsius. It is not over 40 degrees. We are near the seaside, but I have to say the last 2 days in particular have been scorching here. And basically people are probably in siesta mood for the afternoons. I myself was feeling pretty tired. I was just sitting getting a coffee, and that was kind of the mood. It's like super hot, and it will be hot for another day or two, I think, and then it'll break. So got these scorching temperatures, and Russia hasn't hit this city particularly more than before in the last week or two. It's actually been a little bit quieter. They have, of course, attacked other parts of Ukraine with rockets and with drones. But the reverse has also been happening. Ukraine has been sending more and more drones into the Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, in particular Crimea, and into Russia proper. And Russia's air defense at this juncture in the war does not seem to be up to the task. There are just so many more clips circulating in the Russian social media, which is heavily policed, of Ukraine striking both military objects and sometimes also what appear to be civilian objects, like apartment blocks, whether that was because they deliberately targeted them or there was, they just got hit by air defense and then went off target. It's hard to know, obviously, from this far away, but we have seen particular huge amount of footage of oil refineries and other core nodes for the Russian energy sector being struck quite repeatedly in Russia and also in the occupied territories. And as a result, there are fuel shortages in much of the Russian Federation. A lot of Russians have been filming themselves. It's got an error alert now at the moment. So many Russians have been filming themselves queuing for petrol or gas, as you say in American English. Even in Moscow, it appears itself. In Crimea, it doesn't seem like there's much gas left or petrol left. And many Russians who made the poor decision to go on holidays to the Crimean Peninsula, the occupied Crimean Peninsula, found themselves with no way to get home. And one of I would say, the few, if not only real strategic achievement by the Russian Federation since 2022 has been to create a land bridge from Russia de jure, so we're talking about Rostov-on-Don, down through occupied Mariupol, which they sacked and destroyed in early 2022, early to mid 2022, down to the Crimean Peninsula. They already have built a bridge since 2014 from Russia to occupied Crimea, and that bridge has been hit quite often by Ukraine, but it's not being destroyed. However, if you look at the strategic overall position, Ukraine is now, at least at this current point in the war, seemingly able to strike the logistics that go between Russia and Crimea on the road that leads on the sea by the Sea of Azov, so Mariupol, Verdansk, this area down to Crimea. They are striking that regularly. Most of the logistics that travels on it, plus they've been hitting the bridges that connect it to Crimea. That has created a situation where, yes, Moscow still controls on paper all that territory in the land bridge. However, the usefulness of it is being dramatically reduced. Now you need to chance your arm, maybe take a huge risk to actually bring the logistics from from Russia to Crimea. Also, the bridge itself is not considered 100% structurally sound, so they have been reticent, unwilling really to use that as their main way to resupply the peninsula. They've also been using ferries. Ukraine is also so what Ukraine is doing, because they see that Russian air defense is weak. They have expanded their ability with these more medium-term drones, we'll call them. They're not the very short-term drones or short-range drones that you have the FPV type. They're not the very long-range ones we've seen going in, well over 1,000 kilometers into Russia. But they have this in between range drones that now are able to strike the logistics, and Russia doesn't have at this point. They may develop in the next weeks, months, years going ahead, but at this point they seem pretty powerless at trying to stop Ukraine being able to hit their logistics pretty regularly. So it's creating this issue for the Russian Federation. Now on the front lines, not much is moving. Russia's around Konstantinivka. It's a city in the fortress belt in the east of Ukraine in the Donbas region. Now that is part of a strategic objective for Moscow and Vladimir Putin, which is to seize the Donbas region in its totality. That would be a strategic achievement. So they are a long way off from that. Putin gave some other deadline the other day, but he's given like how many deadlines about capturing Donbass? I don't know. I think now it's supposed to be captured by November 1st. He says the reality is that they may actually capture Konstantinivka. That's possible since they're near it. Maybe they captured in a month. Maybe it might be 10 months. Maybe it might be a year and a half. But then after that, there's another, I think about 4 cities they would need to capture, and it would take them at least 2 or 3 years by the current prediction. It could even be 5, depending on which source you want to use as a predictor of what's likely to happen. So that's not something that's going to be achieved in the short term whatsoever. And their ability to resupply Crimea has been undermined. So basically, their only real strategic achievement since 2022, the value of that is being reduced. It's not zero. They still on paper control that territory, and it would take a lot for the Ukrainians to actually cut it off completely by occupying the territory down to the Sea of Azov. And there's no indication that Ukraine's about to do that right now. I have a sneaking suspicion that could be part of the plan to actually take back that territory like they were planning in 2023. But obviously, they are not going to tell us in advance, which was one of the problems with the 2023 summer offensive by Ukraine, is that was so telegraphed and publicized that it made it easier to defend. So that element of surprise and camouflaging what they're planning, maybe they're going to try and take that back. Maybe they're actually going to pivot to somewhere else and try and make an advancement there, or maybe they're just going to sit on defense and let the Russians use up their resources. So all this situation is pretty bad for Vladimir Putin. There's no real light at the end of the tunnel politically. They're talking about the spirit of Anchorage, which was some sort of understanding the Russians felt they had with Donald Trump when they met in Anchorage in Alaska with that summit where Putin was welcomed on the red carpet there. But that doesn't seem to really have come to much. Donald Trump's been distracted by his adventures in the Middle East. And now we've obviously America has elections, midterms coming up, and the price of petrol has been high, so that's not good for winning seats for the Republican Party. So probably he's not going to be of much help to Vladimir Putin. That great white hope that Putin had that Trump would somehow save his train wreck of an invasion seems to not have come to fruition. And the Europeans have promised to pay basically send money to the Ukrainians, keep them going at least for 2 years. In 2027, there are a few elections, like there's going to be a French presidential election that could swing to a more favorable candidate for the Kremlin, but that's kind of the only one currently on the horizon where they might see some sea change. And would that be enough? Probably not to help the Kremlin in this war, at least not a game changer. So that is the current situation here on the ground in terms of what's been happening in the war itself. And as you can see, hasn't been much for Vladimir Putin to be happy about. So to circle back to what this means for his future, people in Moscow, despite the information space being heavily controlled, there has been a good bit of pushback relative to earlier. You see more criticism, people seeing that they can't get their cars with petrol, even in Moscow at times. So that is making many more Russians unhappy, not because they're killing Ukrainians and they're imperialist and it started this illegal war back in 2014 and obviously extended in 2022, because, well, their economy has been in the doldrums for close to a year. In effect, they're in a recession. I mean, they tried to fudge the numbers, whatever, but it's pretty obvious that the economy is in a lot of trouble. And now they're having problems getting basic necessities like petrol. Also, an attempt by the authorities to hammer their ability to use social media and the internet on their phones in the last few months. And that has also led to unprecedented criticism of the Russian government. And we actually saw something reminiscent of the Prigozhin mutiny in terms of the rhetoric that was used by some obscure member of the Russian military. But basically, he was saying that if the Kremlin doesn't welcome him to explain what's really going on, then they would turn their guns on the Kremlin itself. Now, that's probably someone with some psychological problems, because I don't think he's probably going to last very long, at least with his freedom. For having said that in public, you basically, there are laws in Russia saying you can't even criticize the military or this war in general. But we are seeing more and more of this happening in the Russian information space. And that leads to the conclusion that there's a lot more unhappiness in Russian society about the direction of this war. The fact that it's basically making their quality of life a lot worse, and it's become pretty obvious. I know my propaganda is going to persuade you that the fact you can't fill up your car is not a good thing. If you need to go somewhere, no matter what you see on the television or in state-controlled media or state-aligned media. So this has been happening. So this is like a bit of a pressure valve boiling there in Moscow, and a lot of speculation to get clicks is like there's going to be a palace coup, there's going to be an overthrow of Putin because of this. I don't see any concrete signs that is going to happen right now. It is a scenario, it's called a black swan event, someone takes out Putin. But as I said earlier in this live stream, well, I'm not going to get much forewarning of that, because if I did, then Vladimir Putin himself would surely already know and be able to take course of action to prevent it. But there is increasingly, with this discontent in Russian society, and more importantly, amongst the Russian elite, to see the amount of money that they can basically get for themselves, trying to get smaller. The pie is getting smaller and smaller, and that will mean that they will start to fight amongst each other, and there will be more fissures amongst the elite in Moscow. And this is very dangerous for Vladimir Putin to stay in power, because that will mean that more and more of the elite will see that the way forward is to get rid of Putin and replace him, presumably, with someone else who they would prefer. So that is all what is building up in Moscow, but it's something that will be very hard to foresee in advance. That's why it's a black swan event. You just don't see it happening. It probably looks all very obvious in hindsight. Now, more likely conditions that we were seeing being set is for Vladimir Putin to lose power within the next, we'll say, 2 to 3 years, and basically medium term. And that will be that he does not stop the war now or take a pause, which I am leaning towards is going to be his decision. One important indicator of that will be that he goes for another round of mobilization. Could be after there's some, obviously, fake elections, but there's going to be some election season in September. And just after that, he might go for a mobilization. He's already set up the conditions to try and do that. And that would give him, a boost of 300, 500,000 extra troops coming into the battlefield in the next year. And that would increase the size of the Russian military and maybe allow them, at least that would be the argument, allow them to take that strategic objective of the Donbass region. At the current pace, it's going to take them years, but maybe with 300,000, 500,000 extra troops, and if they funnel them all towards that particular part of the front, maybe they could take it within a year or so with that extra force. That could be something that his generals are going to tell him. Would make sense that if with more soldiers, you have more of a chance. However, that is going to be extremely unpopular in Russian society. And if he goes for that, he will probably fail to take the Donbass region within a quick enough time frame for the fact that he will be so unpopular and there will be so much strife in Russian society as a result of that. We saw back in 2022 that a million Russian men actually left the country. So it led to brain drain, and also was deeply unpopular because now you're coming to the end of people you can persuade with money to sign up for the Russian military. For most of them, it's going to end up being somewhere where they end up in the soil here, or they end up invalided or technically missing forever. So when you start to force men to go, obviously their families are going to be not so happy about that. In particular, presumably the pay will not be what it has been for the Russian military so far either. So we'll see a little benefit in that. And increasingly, there is a risk that the government will lose more and more legitimacy, and there will be an opening for someone else to take over in Russia. Also, the fact that it would not work, and I would also, as a reference, say that the Russian ultranationalist sits in a Russian jail. I love to quote him, Igor Girkin. He's a heinous war criminal, but he has been part of the early endeavors by the Russian Federation to invade and take over Ukraine, in particular in Crimea and in the south, in the Donbass back in 2014, 2015. He is sitting in a prison in Russia for criticizing Vladimir Putin, and he has already said that going for mobilization at this point is too late for Russia to actually win the war. So, would it be enough to take Donbass? Maybe, but probably not in a time frame that would allow Vladimir Putin to stay in power. But he may well gamble on that. That is kind of my intuition, is that he's going to go for another mobilization at some point, because the alternative is that he stops the war and then he could stabilize the economy. You probably have more time and probably be able to stay in power for another maybe 5 years, maybe even longer. Maybe you figure out a way to stay in power until he dies of old age, or older age, shall we say then. That is likely if he dies in the next few years. So the big risk with that is, of course, that he has very little to show for over 4 years of warfare. We've almost basically 5 years at that point. And he would have no guarantee that he would ever live to see achieve his place in what he feels should be his rightful place in Russian history, as having reunified the empire by taking back Ukraine. It is possible in the very long term that things could transpire against Ukraine, but would Vladimir Putin even be alive at that point? Hard to know. It could take 5, 10, 20 years for them. There was that gap of almost, how many years was it? It was like about 7 years between, let's say, the real hardcore fighting in 2014 and 2015, and then the second wave of an invasion in 2022. Is he really going to risk waiting that long for things to change in his favor? Because they could also change against him. He was arguing in a better position in 2014, 2015 than he was in 2022, judging by how badly this invasion has gone. So the other issue will be, in the meantime, what to do with all these soldiers. We saw this guy who seemed a little bit crazy, just saying that, if the Kremlin doesn't welcome me in to explain to Putin exactly what's happening, we're going to basically turn our guns on the Kremlin. He would have not just one guy, probably, if he opposed the war, saying that he may have hundreds of thousands coming back from the front, traumatized and pretty angry that they were sent there, maybe made some money, but now they got to go back to working for a lot of them, 10% of what their salary was in the military. To Russia, that's going to have a lot of economic problems and doesn't have a bright future ahead of it. Anyways, it's going to be China's junior partner. It's got a demographic disastrous situation demographically because of the low birth rate. Now they'll have lost so many able-bodied men during this war. Many of them will not be able to reproduce because they're already dead or invalided. So it's going to then have a ripple on effect on Russian society. Also, because if you look at the regions in Russia, the parts of Russia that are Muslim have way higher birth rates than the rest of Russia. So that would mean that the newer generation of Russians coming through, there's going to be these ethnic tensions that are probably going to also become problematic. But the immediate concern for Putin is that there isn't another Prigozhin-like figure who these disgruntled soldiers, they rally around and then they actually try to seize power in some format, either by deposing him or just taking over locally in different regions. He's going to have a lot of trouble if he goes for that. I think it would actually be his more sensible course of action to go for that, because if he goes for mobilization, he'll probably accelerate his own demise, and there is no light at the moment, if you look at it strategically, for him to actually come out of this war ahead. Of course, it could be a black swan event here in Ukraine against the Ukrainian government. Obviously, it's unpredictable, but the chances of that happening, like all black swan events, are that's why the black swan events are unpredictable. So that is something that, there is known unknowns and unknown unknowns, to quote Donald Rumsfeld. But outside of that kind of hope strategy, which is very low probability of success, doesn't look good for either option, which is why I call it a dilemma. So I think he'll probably go for the mobilization. I had expected it to happen earlier, and that will accelerate his demise, and Russian Federation's probably ultimately collapse, in the sense that it will lose control of its current borders and go through some process of decolonization. Probably won't be as dramatic as it was for the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s, early 90s. Won't be that much territory breaking away probably in the beginning. Might be just parts of the Southern Caucasus region, Northern Caucasus region, and that will maybe be it in terms of maybe Chechnya, Dagestan, or some that are breaking away, but maybe a bit more federalization and decentralization of power might also happen rather than a full disintegration. That is an outline of the three scenarios that are most likely: either black swan, which again, very low probability, but that would be an imminent coup d'etat against Vladimir Putin. Most likely, because of what I think Vladimir Putin is going to go for, which is a mobilization, or just not go for mobilization, but also not stop the war. So keep going like this with almost no progress. It's almost certainly going to hasten his demise and the Russian Federation's, maybe not as quick as or dramatic as going for mobilization and failing, but it will still be in this 2 or 3 year time horizon that he will lose power in Russia. This is very, very likely if he doesn't stop the war. If he stops the war, he will probably last longer because he'll be able to stabilize the economy. He would have the risk of obviously a Prigozhin-like figure coming back and all this strife with the soldiers coming back who would be demobilized. As I've said in many other videos and live streams on this channel, one solution for that would be to actually just move all those troops out to the Baltic region. They build all the infrastructure there, or in Belarus, and just threaten to invade NATO with them, at least have them there far away from Moscow. If you were to go to that step further and actually have a limited incursion into a NATO state, I think it would hasten his demise again. I think that would fail. I think not because of what the US would do. I don't expect Donald Trump, America under Donald Trump, to come and actually eject those Russian troops. I think it'd be more likely the allies of whatever countries attacked around them would come and actually successfully eject them, in particular if they were using Ukrainian know-how and technology and tactics, which is almost certain, I think, in that scenario, that Ukrainians would actually come and help fight and kick those Russian troops out of whatever territory they may potentially occupy. And again, that would be an absolute humiliation for Russia to get their ass basically kicked by somewhere like Latvia or Estonia, obviously in conjunction with the allies of those countries. And I think that would almost certainly mean that he would lose power. So those are the different scenarios that I have laid out. Drop your comments either right now if you're watching this live stream, or if you're watching replay, down below in the comments section. So small percentage of a coup d'etat, obviously in a black swan event, but more likely that he continues the war, and we're looking at mobilization, which are bringing all these extra troops, and then fail somewhere like 18 months, 12 to 18 months down the road, or he just fights on without going for mobilization, mean almost no progress. I'm not sure I see the logic. I mean, he just thinks things are magically going to turn in his favor, like they're going to blow up the infrastructure over the winter here in Ukraine again. Maybe, but it didn't work even last winter, one of the coldest winters I think it was the coldest in like half a century here in Ukraine. It was pretty rough. But I think for the Ukrainians then, is it really likely to think that doing the same thing, another time is going to work? Now the Ukrainians have improved their anti-drone capability, and they are working on an anti-ballistic missile exam. So they may even be able to take out most of the Russian ballistic missiles this winter. They mightn't have those in use and up to full efficiency or effectiveness by the beginning of the winter, but probably by December, January, those are going to work pretty well. Seem to be actually on an accelerated timeline for that. So not much hope of that probably working, but it's something he might go for. Then I actually think he may end up falling quicker, a little bit quicker than if he goes for the mobilization. And then if we say he stops the war, it could last many more years, as long as he manages the troops coming back from the front and doesn't actually attack a NATO member state, because I think he would lose in that scenario, and then almost certainly end up like Gaddafi very quickly if you were to do that and fail. But I am not a dictator who's been in power for 25 years in a ruthless place like Moscow. So Vladimir Putin has been making just a long litany of mistakes since 2022. One would conclude that he's probably likely to continue to make them. So, as I've outlined, he probably won't make the smart decisions and probably make the dumb ones again, or the misguided ones, and hasten his own demise. And to conclude it all, will that be good for Ukraine? Probably, but we don't know who's going to replace him in Moscow if that happens. So, could be someone just as imperialist, but actually more competent, and that's not obviously a good outcome. So we prefer to see Russian society change, become non-imperialist, and leave us alone. But probably they will need a significant military defeat, and then decolonization actually come to that conclusion, which was the story for much of Europe and the European imperial powers, in particular those of the 19th century. So let me see if any of you have drawn a comment down below or got any questions. In the meantime, if you're planning to come to Ukraine, down below in the description, I have my guide for coming here. Save you a lot of time. Slightly off topic from what we've been talking about. If you do decide to come here to Ukraine, the next 3 weeks here in Odessa, Mama, are high season and is pretty packed. And lots of people are down by the seaside. Always makes sense in this amazingly hot weather. And in my guide, I have my hospitality part. So my favorite cafes, restaurants, bars, clubs, and shisha. There's so much clubbing going on because we have curfew from midnight to 5 a.m. in most of Ukraine, not in Zakopatska Oblast, Zakopatska over there in the west, but and also in Lviv, it is less strict about a curfew than it is in Odessa. Odessa, I've never been, I've never 1 a.m. in the morning from midnight to 5 a.m. Everything's closed, so you've either got to be inside partying somewhere, I guess, or you're going to be at home asleep. Nonetheless, people go out, especially it is very hectic socially from around close to sunset until 11:30 here in Odessa. We'll say from 8 until about 11:30 is chock-a block. There's so many people here in the city, and it's very vibrant. So that is something to look forward to. Anyways, my guide will save you a lot of time if you decide to come. Also cover Chernovtsi, Uzhhorod, Lviv, and Kyiv in that hospitality guide. Also, if you would like to tap into my encyclopedic knowledge about this region in general and what's happening here in Ukraine, in particular with the upcoming opportunities for investment and getting positioned now so that when the money flows in with the reconstruction, which will happen after this war ends en masse, it's going to be once in a generation event. Well, hopefully once in a generation we'll have this kind of war in Europe, and then the reconstruction afterwards. Then I have my consultant link down below. Go and check it out, and I can assist you in positioning yourself strategically to make the most of those opportunities. And also at the moment, there's a lot of investment into the defense sector here in Ukraine for obvious reasons, because unfortunately, Ukraine is at the cutting edge of drone warfare and military tactics and strategy in 21st century, because this war was foisted up on them by the Russian Federation, by the Russian Reich. And I guess that's the one silver lining in that dark cloud, is the fact that now Ukrainian defense industry is one of the world leaders. And we saw that recently with Zelensky, the president, going over to the Middle East to offer the anti-drone interceptors obviously in exchange for a quid pro quo from those Gulf states. So to continue on here, let me know if you have any questions about or predictions yourself about what will happen to Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Moscow, the Moscow Empire. It's been in power for 25 years of this juncture. So this was a T-shirt that was pretty popular, or at least a motif, which was when the Russian tanks were stuck in the mud, particularly in Kyiv and Kharkiv Oblast back in 2022, and the Ukrainian farmers were towing them away as trophies of war back in those heady days of 2022 when Ukraine successfully defended itself from the Russian invasion, the extended invasion, which had the goal of replacing the government in Kyiv, installing a puppet there, basically neutralizing the Ukrainian military. They call it demilitarization. But what they meant is co-opting parts of it, presumably, and trying to get it into their Russian military, like what they've done in the occupied territories with the mass mobilization, conscription of men there. And they call it denazification, not just trying to murder or force into exile Ukrainian patriots, because they enable anyone who doesn't agree with Russia taking over and being imperialist as some sort of a descendant of the Third Reich. As ridiculous as that sounds, with the current president being Jewish and everything, that is what they have used consistently, and they still continue to talk about it like a bunch of lunatics over there in Moscow, when the reality of the ground is obviously very different. And they're the ones with the Reich, not the Ukrainians. And that obviously failed as well. If you look at basically their strategic objectives, that's why I was saying that the only thing they really achieved is this land bridge between Crimea and Russia proper since 2022. And now that effectiveness that has basically been neutralized by the Ukrainians, and it may be taken back even while Vladimir Putin is in power. And that would mean, again, that he would be in a world of trouble for staying on in power. So that is where we're at. It is super hot here in Odessa. And nonetheless, life goes on. As you can see behind me, there isn't too many people walking around today because it is so hot. And it is now, it's now 4 to 6 up and on for about half an hour. But you can see life goes on as much as possible. We just had an air alert that is now off again. So that is the situation on the ground. In conclusion, drop your predictions and your own analysis down below in the comments section. And I will be back very soon with more coverage from inside Ukraine and lots of reasons to be more optimistic in these difficult times. I already mentioned, I think, in the last live stream, but there was the Black Sea Security Forum. Part of it was actually in the Odessa Opera House here behind me a few weeks ago. It was actually almost a month ago at this point. And the slogan was "End Game?" ? That is the mood here in Ukraine, that depending on what Vladimir Putin decides to do, maybe even next summer, we won't be discussing wartime. Ukraine will just basically be discussing here about the reconstruction of this great country, the biggest country geographically completely contained in Europe, and definitely a standard bearer of what it means to be European and resilient in 2026. So on that note, I will say Slava Ukraini, Heroam Slava, and Do Peremоги.